In this lecture, we are going to talk about one of the more momentous and significant constitutional changes that the British introduced in 1935, known as the Government of India Act of 1935, which certainly introduced certain important innovations like, for example, the responsible government in the provinces, but which at the same time created the basis for greater disunity in Indian politics. The Congress participated in the elections, formed ministries in several provinces, but the performance of the ministry at one level created disappointment in the minds of their own followers, while the Muslim League started complaining about discriminatory treatment by the Congress. And it is also argued that by creating a distinct provincial sphere in the Indian constitutional system, imperial constitutional system for that matter, Muslim League was encouraged to come up with their demand for their own spheres, basing on the kind of influence that they had already begun to acquire in some of the Muslim majority provinces. So, provincialization of politics is often looked upon as one important consequence of the 35 Act, which encouraged Muslim League to concentrate on certain areas as their own preserves. So, judging by the consequences of the 1935 Act, which at one level, of course, opened up opportunities for power to Indian politicians, including congressmen, it had some long-term unpalatable effects. If you go through the history of the run-up to the 35 Act, fairly a long interlude between the introduction of the Montague-Chelmsford reforms in 1919 and the enactment of a new constitution in 1935, one should actually locate the reasons for a further revision of the constitutional structure in the failure of the Montague-Chelmsford reforms.
Sir, why was it that the Reform Council of 1919 didn't actually fulfill its own objectives?
In the first place, the Montague-Chelmsford reforms, as you know, didn't create responsible government. It certainly broadened the electorate, it made provisions for direct election, but there were very stringent property qualifications. A system of diarchy was created, but Indian ministers became associated only in relatively unimportant departments, known as transferred subjects. And the kind of demand that the Congress had already been making, like, for example, the creation of a full-fledged parliamentary system, was never fulfilled by the provisions of this act. Despite these limitations, Gandhi at one stage was in favor of accepting these reforms, but ultimately, as you know, because of a number of reasons, because of the Punjab massacre, because of the Rowlatt agitation, because of the manner in which draconian measures were introduced, almost synchronizing with the Montague-Chelmsford reforms, this act didn't actually attract congressmen. Congress was resistant to the idea of participating in these elections and working in the councils. As a consequence, those moderate politicians who had once been congressmen but who decided to break away from the Congress because of the Congress's reluctance to work the reforms ultimately formed the Liberal Party or the National Liberal Federation. Some Muslim politicians also participated in the Reformed Council, but Congress decided to stay away from it. You are all familiar with the history of how the cycle of agitation that was unleashed from 1919 onwards ultimately climaxed in the non-cooperation agitation, and once the non-cooperation movement was withdrawn, some of these people who had once agreed with Gandhi's idea or Gandhi's view that it was more important to participate in the non-cooperation movement than participating in the Reformed Council, wished to participate in the Reformed Council. Arguments of people like Motilal Nehru or Chittaranjan Das, they felt that Indians should try to break the council system from within. They would get elected to the council but refuse to be associated with the government, and they would constantly block the government by creating continuous blockades, continuous barriers against their laws. Now, this strategy was not likely to last long, because there were Swarajists who were followers of Das and Nehru, but who would not remain satisfied with this kind of a position. They would be keen to accept ministry, to accept office, and on this issue of office acceptance, ultimately disagreements occurred within the Swarajist party. There were groups within the Swarajya party who dissented with this strategy and started demanding the right to participate in the government. Around the middle of the year 1926, some people had defected from the party to join the government. So it is in this context of the collapse of the Swarajya experiment that we see the renewal of agitation once again. You know how Sir John Simon, who was appointed the chairman of a new commission which was to inquire into the possibilities of further constitutional reforms, something that was stated by Montague himself in 1917, that every 10 years the constitutional arrangement should be reassessed in order to suggest further improvements. So Simon was appointed precisely with that objective, but the disadvantage of the Simon Commission was that it actually smacked of imperial arrogance. There was no Indian member. So the Congress decided to boycott it, and there was a renewed agitation against Simon Commission. And between the Congress, who had a certain idea about the dominion status, and the British bureaucracy, there were serious differences of views. While they took the decision to boycott the Simon Commission, in the Madras session in 1927, they also asked Motilal Nehru to prepare a draft constitution. And Nehru, along with Tej Bahadur Sapru, presented the Nehru report. And the Nehru report, for all practical purposes, was a draft constitution.
Sir, how did the Nehru report visualize a constitutional system for free India?
In fact, it was a constitution. It was a kind of a constitutional document. Many of these provisions ultimately became important, became relevant when the Indian Constitution was drafted by the Constituent Assembly after independence. If you study the Nehru report closely, you will see how it was inspired by American and British constitutions. It suggested in the first place the creation of a federal democratic structure, but with greater concentration of authority in the hands of a central government. Precisely the opposite position that or to what the League would actually look for, provincialization. It suggested inclusion in the Constitution of a series of fundamental rights, a parliamentary system based on adult franchise, clear demarcation of power between the central and provincial governments, redrawing of the boundaries of the provinces according to language, linguistic reorganization of the state, that was to happen later, and a free independent judiciary. The Congress called upon the government to accept the Nehru report, and accepting the Nehru report was virtually acceptance of dominion status, accepting the idea that India would remain a part of the British Commonwealth, but for all practical purposes, India would be governed by an independent parliament elected on the basis of universal suffrage, choosing their ministers from the legislature, and the ministers would have complete parliamentary responsibility. So it was responsible government. There was an agreement about India's existence within the Commonwealth, within the empire. But even if India remained a part of the empire, India would evolve like other dominions, like Australia. As you can see from the Nehru report, that it was a perfectly liberal document, acceptable to liberal politicians, including a person like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who in 1927 was agreeable to function in collaboration with the Congress to achieve the objective of a dominion status. But there were provisions in the Nehru report which ultimately alienated him. The Nehru report suggested, instead of communal electorate or reserved electorate, joint electorate. It was not in favor of continuing with the system of reserved constituencies. But the Nehru report, or the kind of discussion that it had initiated, became somewhat irrelevant between its publication in 1928 and the commencement of the civil disobedience movement. In between, you have an animated discussion among politicians about dominion status.
Sir, how did the Congress and the British leadership interpret the dominion status differently?
The dominion status, as the Nehru report actually suggested, implied virtually independent parliamentary government. But there was a willingness on their part to function within the British Commonwealth. And this was precisely the view of many British politicians from 1926-27 onwards. But there were some officials, the British bureaucracy by and large was resistant to this idea. In order to sell this idea, the British political establishment had to elicit the consent of the conservatives, who were not in a mood to accept dominion status in this sense. They would go as far up to as colonial self-government, that you have some self-governing institutions in the colonies in order to satisfy Indian political aspirations, but the idea of a severance of the relationship with the mother country was out of question. But there were congressmen who were also not happy with the idea of a dominion status. By then, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, they had already started demanding full self-government, Purna Swaraj. Ultimately, the Purna Swaraj resolution came to be adopted in 1929 at Lahore Congress, when the government rejected the Nehru report. Still, there was a compromise. The government was asked to accept it. The Purna Swaraj resolution was accepted. And finally, the ground was now ready for the renewal of agitation for the civil disobedience campaign. Now, that story is well known. But what you must note at this point is that all the while when the civil disobedience campaign was continuing, the British government was trying to outmaneuver the Congress through certain kinds of concessions that they were promising. Arvind, for example, was very keen to introduce dominion status with some safeguards, but his position was not acceptable to many British conservative politicians. But that is a different story. You have such disagreements occurring frequently among British politicians about what to do with India in future. But despite all these disagreements, we can see a very clear objective on the part of the British to outmaneuver the Congress during the civil disobedience campaign by convening the Roundtable Conference with the package of reforms, offering a few concessions to the Congress. But the first Roundtable Conference, as you know, Congress didn't participate. There was no Congress representative. But in the first Roundtable Conference, in which some liberals, some Muslim leaders, the princes were present, they first floated the idea of autonomy, federation. The federation idea was that there should be a federation in which the princes would join with their distinct identity kept intact. There would be some measure of provincial autonomy, responsible government in the province, but gradually responsible government would be introduced at the center, by which it means that the government would become accountable to an elected parliament. Then you have this Gandhi-Arvind Pact, then Gandhi's decision to participate in the second Roundtable Conference, where the same idea was reiterated, same proposals were reiterated. Ambedkar came up with the demand for a separate electorate for the depressed classes. It is in this kind of a situation when Gandhi was not very certain about what to do with the Round Table Conference, which was not actually giving him anything. He was coming back empty-handed. Ramsay MacDonald announced his devious MacDonald Award in August 1932, by which he reiterated the British commitment to preserve the separate electorate for the Muslims, but in addition, the MacDonald Award also promised separate electorate for the untouchables. The situation was saved by Gandhi's fast. Gandhi went on a fast unto death. Ultimately, there was pressure on Ambedkar, and Ambedkar eventually agreed about joint electorate, but also ensured that there should be greater representation of untouchables in the representative assemblies. So these tortuous negotiations, interspersed with movements, set the stage for the Act of 1935. Now this Act had two aspects, the federal and the provincial.
Sir,
Yes.
to what extent was this Act of 1935 an improvement on Montague-Chelmsford reform?
In one respect, it was certainly an improvement because it introduces provincial autonomy. It allows the formation of elected government at the provincial level, elected by the legislature and responsible therefore to the legislature. But this principle, which was expected also to be introduced at the central level, at the federal level, was never introduced, partly because of the reluctance of the princes ultimately to accept this package. As I was saying, that it has two different aspects. One was the federal aspect or the central aspect, and the other the provincial aspect. At the federal level, the Act provided for an assembly where the Muslims would have their own representation based on separate electorate and very weighty representation at that. Congress only had around 30% representation, even though the Congress had so much of popularity and so much of a following all over India. The princes had a clear representation of 40% in the council of the state and 24% in the federal legislature. And their representatives were not meant to be elected representatives. The princes would nominate their representatives to the Council of State and to the federal legislature. Two institutions were actually provided for by the Constitution. And ultimately, the idea was to assuage the princes and persuading them to remain as the principal bulwark of imperial rule. And unless the princes accepted this, the implementation of this scheme at the federal level was to be deferred. So the war intervened, as a consequence of which, at the federal level, this reform was never enacted. At the provincial level, as I was saying, the provision was made for some kind of a responsible government, although the governor continued to retain their emergency powers. What was implemented ultimately in 1937 was not the federal scheme, which could not be implemented because of the refusal of the princes ultimately to accept it. What was implemented was the provincial autonomy, elected assembly with an enlarged electorate, governor with emergency powers, Indian ministers to be appointed from the legislature and responsible to the assembly. Because of the incompleteness of the reform and the non-introduction of the federal scheme, Nehru ultimately described it as a charter of slavery, called for the rejection of this scheme altogether. About that story you are familiar, that there were left-wing in the Congress who never wanted to accept this reform and wanted to start an agitation against it, but eventually the right wing of the Congress actually decided to accept these reforms, participate in the elections, formed ministries in as many as 8 provinces, and the ultimate upshot of this was the Congress involvement in a system of power that the imperial rule created, but in the process discrediting itself. But that is a different story. When you look at the new provisions, you see how the princes were given a position that had never been accorded in the past. The Montague-Chelmsford reforms had excluded them altogether. Now the princes were brought within the framework of an Indian constitution with a very weighty representation in Federal Assembly and the Council of the State. And at the same time, you have an effort on the part of the government to create very distinct provincial spheres. And Muslim League was deeply interested in this and never approved of the kind of unitary idea that Nehru report had espoused. So it has some very significant implications.
Sir, what were the long-term consequences of this act?
If you look at the immediate aftermath of the legislation, that after the law was passed, it took almost 2 years for the government to implement it. And when it was implemented in the teeth of some kind of opposition by the princes themselves. The princes were no longer interested to become a part of this constitutional structure by participating within the dominion status. By then, they had come to realize that dominion status was not going to be implemented very soon. As far as the provincial autonomy aspect of the constitution is concerned, this was a tangible development. You can see involvement of Indian ministers in different governments. Congress, despite the unwillingness and reluctance of the Congress radicals, wished to participate in the elections. There was a hectic election campaign. Ultimately, Congress had a clear majority in 6 states and ultimately formed government in 2 others. Now they were in power. And their people had expected from the Congress ministers certain tangible reforms. Reform in the land system, reform in the labor laws. Nothing of this sort actually came out of these Congress ministries. On the contrary, as you know by now, that the Congress ministries often passed laws which went against the interest of these classes, whom the Congress represented as the sole representative of the Indian people. Communal bitterness became more pervasive. In the Congress majority provinces, the Muslim League constantly complained about the possibility of a Hindu majoritarian tyranny on the minorities. So one can see in the emergence of distinct provincial spheres of power the seed of a far more serious discord of the future. Because it was on the basis of the kind of control that the Muslim League was able to establish in the provinces, using the opportunities available from their control over the provincial government, that they successfully pursued the Pakistan idea, which they proclaimed in 1940 and ultimately wished to achieve through direct action in August 1946, which is a different story. But this sordid story had its roots in the way the Act of 1935 had created certain distinct provincial spheres which the Muslim League used to their great advantage. To that story we'll turn later.